So there we go. So we got Caspian here. We're going to be discussing the Ukraine crisis. It's day 5 now of the invasion, and we're going to be trying to see what impact this has had and will continue to have on the energy markets. It's been quite a hot war so far. We've seen Russian forces trying and largely failing to push into large areas of Ukraine. They're sitting maybe 30, 40 kilometers north of Kiev at the moment, and they keep trying to take the capital, but they do keep being repelled. And so we're going to be trying to work out and trying to discuss together how we see the energy market playing out over the kind of short and mid-term, how Europe's influence and how America's influence may change policies and reactions from the conflict. So.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much for inviting me on. I super appreciated our last chat on this. Clearly, events have moved pretty dramatically, and maybe some of the core suggestions Manus and I were making, I think it was only a month or two ago, have turned out to have come a lot faster than I think many of us would have thought. I think before we get on to the energy impact, we kind of wanted to discuss briefly the state of play, because of course, much of the energy and market impact, both to immediate inflation, but also long-term energy policy, is going to be derived a little bit for how this plays out. As you say, we're in day 5, and I don't know what your view is, but clearly the thought that this was going to be over pretty quickly now looks increasingly unlikely.
Yeah, I mean, we even saw Russian state media outlets and the major players in Moscow posting all simultaneously yesterday what was presumably a pre-planned message about how Russia has taken Kiev and these are Putin's goals, and then within 15 minutes they were deleted because they realized they hadn't actually taken Kiev. So this conflict is playing out in ways that I don't think the West or Russia thought would happen. But with Brent today has just dropped below $100 a barrel, up from its weekend high, I think it's very clear that the impact on energy markets, the impact on European energy markets, is something which countries were very, very cautious to kind of have. Like the impact was something that they were very conscious of when dealing with sanctions. So,
but I think this kind of comes back, and clearly, for background for everyone, Ukraine's a huge transit country. About 30% of Russian flows come through Ukraine. We know Russian volumes remain about 30% below 2019 levels on a monthly basis, and that's caused wholesale energy prices to rise by about 400%. So much of the challenge and inflationary cost of living crisis that certainly Europe is facing, but also impacting other markets as well, is directly because of this escalation. However, I think it almost goes back to this first question about what happens next is really down to how long this goes for. And I think ultimately, when you look at this, Putin's clearly made some big miscalculations. The first miscalculation he's made is ultimately how easy militarily this operation would have been. He's spent the last 10 or 20 years, whether it be in Georgia, Chechnya, Kazakhstan, Belarus, Crimea, effectively investing in what he believed was clearly a very effective military capability that, if you look at him from Moscow's perspective, actually has been pretty damn effective at most of the challenges that they faced over the last 20 years. So his belief of that effectiveness going into this crisis may not have been particularly misplaced, right? And certainly Western observers, I think, similarly agreed that this operation would be relatively quick and brutal. But I think clearly the resolve of the Ukrainian forces has been outstanding, and no one could not be moved by the scenes of the enlisting queues, etc., has meant that military capability in Ukraine was clearly underestimated, and how easy this would have been for Russian forces has been severely overstated. So I think that's the first issue, which clearly Putin's miscalculated on. And that now means that we're in a much more elongated crisis. The second point that he's clearly miscalculated on is Western resolve. Again, it wouldn't have been crazy to agree with the Moscow line that America is in decline, American tilt towards the Pacific really starts to undermine the notion of how interested, the main hegemonic power is in Ukraine. European defense is extremely weak. Germany's defense budget's 1.3% of GDP. France is bogged down in Mali. Britain's just left the European Union. Okay, that's not a military structure, but Europe looks fragmented. Again, not if we'd sat here 2 or 3 months ago, we may have concurred with the Russian strategists, right, in saying on both points, you are dominant militarily and the Western response is likely to be weak and fragmented.
Yep.
But in reality, both points, they've been wrong, right? The military opposition has been far stronger and Western unity has been far more effective than I think many people would have thought. So what does that mean for energy markets? Well, if this had ended quickly, you could have imagined a scenario where prices start to return to some form of normality, at least from the Russian side. So Russia's saying if it controlled Ukraine and the pipelines, we'll keep the gas flowing. And then the real question was, how was the West going to respond with sanctions? Now, in that scenario, I think it would have been really a hard sell on the Western populace, if you like, to have effectively sanctions in perpetuity on Russian gas, and how quickly you could curtail Russian dependence from gas, I think is a really uncertain question. 30 to 40% of German gas, depending on the country in Central Europe, is dependent on Russia. Getting alternative sources online quickly, that takes time, right? So if this had been over really quickly, I think Putin's calculation that actually, what was it the West was really going to do to hurt Putin in the core, real vulnerable area for Russia, which is gas supply and oil and gas? Yes, we can do the sanctions of the banks and the oligarchs, but actually, I'm not really sure Putin really cares about that, right? I'm not sure this is a guy who particularly cares about the actual living standards of many of his compatriots in Russia. I think he's interested in hard realpolitik, and the only way you can really hurt Russia in that respect is to stop using their gas. However, we're not in that scenario, or it doesn't look likely we're going to be in that scenario. We're going to be in the scenario where he hasn't totally militarily dominated Ukraine. Western resolve, I'd suggest, is going to be stronger because Ukraine is still in play, right? It's still now conceivable that public opinion in Russia, the oligarchs start to isolate Putin, the Russian military hierarchy starts to question whether this is really going their way. You can start to see a scenario in which actually this really doesn't go very well for Russia. So I'd imagine those sanctions from the West in this scenario are going to be pretty strong. And the cost for domestic populations, I'd imagine, are going to be really high. Biden's leveled with the American public and said, look, your gasoline prices are going to rise. We haven't seen that yet from European leaders, for obvious reasons, because the costs are going to be extremely high in Europe if we're going to really start to try to wean ourselves off Russian gas. But I'm imagining at the moment that's the way it's going.
Yeah, and so I was going to then follow up with and what do you think, Caspian? What do you think the tipping point will be for states like Germany, like Italy, who are very dependent on Russian imports of gas or very dependent on exporting to Russia certain goods? I know Italy is. What do you think the tipping point will be for them to agree with the consensus that's trying to be driven by Britain and say, actually, if you cut off Russian oil and gas, that stops this war?
Absolutely. And I think that's the question. And this is where I still believe this has been a huge miscalculation for Putin, because that consensus has now been reached in the medium term. We're, from what we're hearing out of Berlin, who couldn't have been shocked at the change in public policy from Germany? This is a country which has, for decades, kept open business as usual relationships with Russia, regardless of the weather or climate, has maintained the use of Russian gas. It's very cost effective. Obviously, Germany is an industrial manufacturing powerhouse. Those kind of, it's easier for us as a service economy in the UK to put a few percentage points on energy because we're not an energy intensive economy. Germany, it really hurts. So it's resisted this. But look, the latest statements, Nord Stream 2 has been cancelled. They're going to wean themselves off Russian gas. They're starting to build LNG terminals, so that's liquefied natural gas that can be imported from other sources. And of course, that statement on defense spending rising to 2%. So big changes. And I think the medium term, frankly, Putin's really miscalculated this, because the energy policy transition is now to reduce and remove dependence from Russia in the medium term. But the problem is, for European capitals, is what the hell do we do tomorrow? Because, you know, to build an LNG terminal is a 5 or 10 year process. And, you know, we in Western Europe, or sort of more the Atlanticist side, the US, UK, France and Portugal, have always made this point that, look, you're vulnerable because of the timelines here. And it's not immediately obvious what someone like Germany can do within the next 5 years. Now, obviously, Putin's hope is that in 5 years' time, maybe people forget about all of this and you know, the problem goes away. But I think we've got to trust the intent of countries like Berlin and Poland and some of the sort of central continental countries, that they now understand through this crisis of the need to transition. But look, in the medium term, you're still going to have to buy Russian gas, right? And that fundamentally is the big problem for continental Europe. Yeah. The US obviously absolutely in fits of anger about this, because they've been saying this for decades. But right now, we can cut gas at the margins, right? We can reduce our purchasing of Russian gas 10, 20%, fine. We can get more from Qatar through Italy. We can import more through the Turkish sort of Asia Minor route from the Caspian Sea. But the big volumes are still going to have to come from Russia in the medium term.
And so, quickly taking you back, you were talking about how there have been warnings from the UK and from the Atlantic, kind of NATO and Western European member states. How did Germany and other Central European states get to the point where they are this dependent on Russian gas, despite the warnings? Is this a case of they really, really need the cheap energy at cost of national security, or did they decide that the warnings weren't relevant?
Yeah, I think if you read the continental press, Die Welt, Le Monde, you know, there will be a certain amount of interpretation that the Anglo-Saxon world saber rattles a lot and has over dramatized and over-egged the risk that we've seen with Russia. And certainly both Germany and France, for unique historical reasons, have sought a relationship with Russia. France, of course, historically was also not a big fan of NATO, right? It pulled out of NATO briefly in the 80s. And so there's a relationship there. Germany, for lots of historical reasons and benign reasons and virtuous reasons, and we shouldn't, there's a lot of kind of criticism of the German position at the moment, but I think we should also acknowledge that there are lots of legitimate reasons why a strong relationship with Russia was desirable, because of some historical pieces. And it's not just the cynical economic advantages, although clearly, you know, Russian gas is very cheap, right? And post that nuclear decision from Fukushima, which you could say in hindsight has been a disastrous overreaction in response to the risks of nuclear power, has led us to be in this situation. So I think there's a mix of reasons. Some of them are economic, some of them are, you know, for historical reasons, a benign belief in neutralism and of cooperation with Russia has led Germany to underestimate the risks. And unfortunately, we find ourselves in this situation.
Yeah, we do indeed. And then to comment on the nuclear situation you mentioned there, in your opinion, could we see a change in policy again, like a double U-turn on nuclear, if Germany suddenly turns around and says, actually, we do need it? Because I know France is still kind of 65, 70% dependent on their nuclear program, which is brilliant. It means that they're like much more insulated from market shocks.
Yeah.
But that German decision in 2014, 2015, I believe the last of their reactors is due to be put offline in 2024. Do you expect that will continue and they will find LNG from somewhere else? Or will they turn around and say, actually, we're going to keep these reactors online and potentially build new ones?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think, to be honest, from what I've seen of the public policy and opinion polls, you're not going to see massive nuclear in Germany. The argument's been lost. You could see, because of the need to get off gas, the extension of existing nuclear plants to provide some baseload nuclear power closer into the 2030s in response. But I don't think you're going to see, or I'd be surprised to see, unless the political situation really starts changing, that you're going to see new nuclear power in Germany. Although, look, who knows? A lot has just changed in the last 48 hours. So I think making, huge grandiose statements is probably unwise. But no, I don't suspect balance on probability. What I suspect is that Germany will, not least because nuclear is expensive, right? So what France benefits or gains in terms of energy security, it does have some of the highest energy wholesale prices in Europe. And again, it goes back to the nature of the German economy. I just don't think that's really possible as a public policy option unless you're going to subsidize quite materially, which I don't know if it's possible in light of state aid rules and the single market. So no, I don't think that nuclear is going to be embraced. What I think is going to happen is that US LNG is going to come to the rescue. And if you're a cynic, the US have been trying to push their LNG on Europe for, since the shale revolution started about a decade or two ago. Europe has always thought, well, we've got loads of Russian gas. We don't really need to ship this over the Atlantic. Now I think this is really all to play for the US, and Biden's probably playing a very good game here, and this is the perfect environment to repivot US shale gas, which has been predominantly domestically consumed. He wants to decarbonize, but he knows there's hundreds of thousands, millions of potential supply chain and direct job impact, especially in swing states, right, which he's got to win in 2 years' time, and there's November midterm election. So a great answer to this political risk is to repivot his domestic shale sector effectively to save Europe from Russian gas dependence. And I would expect that to happen in the medium term. There may be some changes like the North Sea. So in the UK, I expect are probably now going to approve those North Sea wells much more quickly than potentially we were a few months ago. And the Dutch may reconsider shutting down some of their domestic onshore production. Those, I imagine, are what the medium-term policy is going to look like.
So regarding the US, how does that contrast with Biden's previously stated kind of green energy aims and the shutting down of fracking and drilling and exploratory drilling on national park lands? Do you think those will remain, or will he be able to turn to voters who were very kind of enthralled by his green policies and say, actually, look, we need to help our European allies and make some money cost of potentially environmental degradation?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, Biden's green policies maybe haven't been as watertight as potentially commentators have suggested. So the fracking ban was always on federal land. Most shale extraction isn't on federal land, right? So it's a competence of the state. To get that competence removed from the state and passed to the federal level, you need to pass some serious legislation, which is just not going to happen in the Senate arithmetic that we've got. So the fracking stuff was always a bit of window dressing for elections, in my opinion. You can take your own view. On the realpolitik of it, he'll try to square this circle by saying, guys, we're going green. They've just had New York bite offshore wind auction. The volume of offshore wind and renewable energy that Biden's pursuing is phenomenal, right? So UK is the largest offshore wind provider in the world right now. In 1 or 2 years, the US will be adding basically all of the UK capacity every single year, right? So the scale that we're dealing and talking about in the US is absolutely insane. So that's how I imagine he's going to placate his green lobby, the kind of AOC, more left flank of the Democrats. But also to keep the moderates like Joe Manchin on board, he'll be repivoting those oil and gas jobs to service export. So that's his strategy. Agreed. Whether the left are going to kind of, call BS basically on this and say, well, whether it's burnt here or in Europe, does it matter? I don't know. That's US politics for you.
Yeah. I mean, the Eastern Seaboard offshore wind kind of block that they sold, I think it was kind of 2 days ago. I know that raised $4.5 billion in one day, which is absolutely ludicrous. But so if we talk about
Baringa actually advised one of the winning bidders in that, and that was a huge piece for many of the European oil and gas majors who are pivoting into renewables in Europe, and now see a huge opportunity to take that skill and experience to the US. So,
yeah, and if we're talking about the US, I feel like we have to bring China into the conversation because they're the third major player on the global stage at the moment, if not including Russia, then maybe the fourth. But so with Europe decidedly trying to move away from Russian gas and oil, Russia's got to look to kind of offload that production somewhere else. Otherwise, they're going to have a gigantic budget or a bigger budget deficit than they already have. And so largely that's going to go to China. So I have two main questions here. And the first is that does China and that kind of East Asia region have the demand for Russian gas that would fill the kind of void left by Europe? And in your opinion, does that then leave Russia actually dependent on a potentially more adversarial and demanding ally in China?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And yeah, I mean, to be honest, that's the big geopolitical question now. Have we seen the reemergence of a Sino-Soviet alliance, so-called, and the reemergence of a kind of, if not anti-Western, certainly protagonistic to American hegemony axis in the world that we haven't seen for 30 or 40 years? I think clearly on one level, we're starting to see that emerge. And the question is how strong it is. China noticeably hasn't explicitly condemned the actions in Russia, as we know that they wouldn't, and is kind of doing as little as it needs to do to remain in polite company, but providing Russia with sufficient cover probably to continue in the medium term at least. There may be a point where it just gets untenable for China to not condemn Russia, but I don't think we're there yet. And India as well, who's dependent on certain raw materials, but also exports, has not come out and condemned Russia and won't be involved in sanctions for certain critical goods for India. So there is a sympathetic axis. It's one that may play ultimately badly for Putin. I'm still doubtful that Russia gets as much out of this relationship as China. China's clearly getting diplomatic cover and would like a precedent set for any intervention in Taiwan. I think that's quite obvious. And certainly if the notion of American Western national self-determination that we've all experienced and all believe in liberal society is started to be curtailed, and this concept of manera broad and sphere of influence is the sort of 19th century concept start to come back in, then yeah, China clearly wins a lot more rope to do what it wants in the South China Sea. But for Russia, it may have been winning some short-term support from China, but dependence on China, I don't think can fully compensate for the sanctions that the West are putting in place. So China is a huge gas importer. It's the largest consumer of LNG in the world. And yes, it does have the capability to import Russian gas at significant volumes, but the investment needed to get the same pipeline volumes to China, as is the case to Europe, would be ginormous and take a decade at least, right? So there's one pipeline to China. There's tens of pipelines into Central Europe with a magnitude about 10 times the capacity. So on top of that much more small volume capacity, the nature of the contracts with China are much more less profitable for Russia, basically. China prefers to buy long fixed-term contracts, very, very lower margins for Russia, but for a 10-year period of time. So Russia gains some supply security, but actually the profitability of gas that it's sold to China on the current contracts that we've seen is not particularly high. So yes, we're seeing a thawing of relationship. Is that dangerous? I think it is, because if Russia feels that it only really has one way to go, and that's into the arms of China, I'm not sure that that's good for Eurasia security, because a Russia with a lot of arms and nowhere to go, feeling sanctioned and isolated, may not be a particularly peaceful Russia. But I think China's getting a lot from this, and probably Xi Jinping has played a pretty astute move here. We'll see how it develops.
Awesome. And then I guess to kind of to wrap it all off, do you see in the kind of immediate term? Oh, I was going to actually comment when you were talking about China and India both staying reasonably neutral, sitting on a very, very tight fence. That actually that may have been the only prediction that Mr. Putin got correct when he decided to invade Ukraine, is that he could basically guarantee that China and India wouldn't come out strongly against him. But can you see that forming into another kind of like avenue out for Russia in the immediate term? Because we're seeing that there are resolutions in the General Assembly and the Security Council trying to condemn Russia. There's been a move to there's been a move to remove Russia from their permanent seat in the Security Council. Ukraine has filed lawsuits in The Hague for alleged Russian war crimes. Can you see Russia and India, maybe Iran, using or trying to leverage diplomatic weight to stop this? And to what extent, at what point do you see that reversing? Do you see China actually saying, like, Russia, you need to stop?
It just depends whether this starts to get embarrassing. And it's a terrible word, isn't it, given that, people's lives are being at risk. But the reality probably for Xi Jinping and Modi and the Saudis and Iran is, does this tacit support, or at least looking the other way, start to really isolate them and make it really uncomfortable and awkward for them on the world stage? I think that really depends about the nature of the conflict in in Ukraine. If it's elongated but cools, then maybe this status quo could last for some time. If Putin responds with escalation and the targeting of civilians or more discriminate attacks on cities, I could imagine a scenario where, yes, even China's support starts to become untenable. Because what China actually wants is respectability on the world stage, right? It doesn't want to be a pariah state, which is why it was quite happy when the Russians did the heavy lifting in Kazakhstan, for example. It doesn't want to be perceived as an imperial power. So, I think that would probably be the line that would need to start being crossed.
Okay, awesome. Well, I'm out of questions, so thank you very much for your time.
No, thank you.